What would it feel like if you had 10,000 words of Shakespeare in your mind? That's a little less than the words Hamlet speaks in the play. 10,000 words is approximately the Book of Mark. I've never done that amount of memorization. My Sanskrit mantras that I've memorized are just over 2,000 words now, and I have smatterings of Shakespeare here, there, and the other place. But Ashley Strand has done Shakespearean roles, and he performs the Book of Mark in its entirety from memory. And in today's episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, Ashley joins us to explain the real work behind how that's done. And you can actually see him do it live yourself by going to kingjameslive.org, and there's a video recorded version of him performing the Book of Mark from memory as well. I really appreciated this conversation, and if you like this kind of information and you're new here, please get subscribed, hit that thumbs up for the love of memory, because these are the kind of deep dives into the real work that I want to be able to share with you more. And wow, this has got many, many points in it that I think are going to help people that do want to memorize long form verbatim, but want to memorize anything. Now, it might be hard for you to think, well, I'm studying physics, and how is this going to help me with mathematical equations? I will put a little summary at the end of this discussion, sharing how that I think that it will help you. But it helps me to have this kind of conversation because it reasserts some of the things that I already know, but also helps me think differently about different ways to approach long-form verbatim memorization to improve my own game. So without further ado, let's get started with this wonderful deep dive investigation into the real work of what it takes to memorize and deliver with passion, verve, gravitas from your memory. Ashley, thank you so much for joining me on this discussion time together to talk about some extraordinary things you do with your memory that I know a lot of people want to do, especially with memorizing the gospel and scriptures and so forth. And kingjameslive.org is an opportunity to actually see you do it live, either through a link to video, but also live in the flesh in an auditorium. And I just am grateful to have the opportunity to speak with you about that. And that's an extraordinary amount of text. I think it's more than 10,000 words, the Book of Mark.
It's a lot. Yes. Well, thank you, Anthony, for having me. I was very touched that you reached out to me after I told you why I was interested in memory. And yes, against all expectations of my own, I have memorized the King James Version of the Gospel according to Mark. And the way it came about was, it was kind of funny. I was led to it by ego, because I was working for a Shakespeare company that had run out of money, and they couldn't afford to hire actors who had the skills to come to North Carolina from New York to round out a Shakespeare cast, which is typically a huge cast.
Right.
So the director came to me and he said, "What do you think about doing a one-man show?" And immediately I said, "With me, you're a genius, And I didn't even, so sight unseen, I just said yes to being the only guy on stage because, of my profound need for attention. And then he told me what it was going to be. And I said, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to adapt it? And he said, no, we're going to do it word for word. And that's when I really sort of, swallowed hard and thought, oh, and then I read the thing. And, I think we'll probably end up talking about this as a feature of the type of memorization that I do. I found it very difficult to read the King James Version. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in the King, there's unfamiliar vocabulary, not that much actually. The bigger thing with the King James Version is that it's a version of English that's before a lot of grammatical standardization had happened. It was kind of whatever people could understand, and people had different constructions, and you have different constructions from one place to another within the same text. It's fairly consistent within the King James text, but very different from what we're used to now. So there's inversions in word order sometimes, and it's just trying to read it is very difficult.
Right.
And I read it about the first time I read it, I thought, man, how am I gonna make this entertaining? I mean, I can recite it, but it was so the way the language came through my eyes was so distancing to me that I really couldn't even grasp it. And then what started to happen is that I started to look at the images, and right there, and I think it's the third verse. There's this beautiful image, which is the voice of one crying in the wilderness. And I
Mm.
thought, that is an image an actor can use. That captures a feeling of isolation and alienation and despair, that we've all felt. And so these things started to draw me in. And after many, many readings, I saw, wait a minute, this is a story with a perfect dramatic arc. It doesn't have a lot of sermons in it. It's just plot point to plot point. It's from Jesus's baptism to his crucifixion and resurrection. And it's just one thing to the next, everything in a sequence. But it was interesting. What's interesting about that is I thought, okay, so it took me 10 times reading it to see all that because I was so distanced by the language. And yet, when I went out and read it to people, they connected with it. And as I started to speak it, I figured out is that, that version was written to be spoken. It was not written to be read. So it turns out if you go and see it, as long as you can fill that arcane, not arcane, but that sort of archaic language with the appropriate emotion, I figure out what it means in the book, looking up what things mean and all that. And then I fill it with the correct emotion and the correct intention. The language comes alive, and it's really much more accessible than people think. Shakespeare, so the King James Version of the Bible was published in 1611, which is the same year that Hamlet is thought to have been first performed. So the language is very contemporary. Shakespeare is famous for having introduced 31,000 words, new words to the language. At least that's the first time that those words appear in print in English or in his plays, right? And the average vocabulary of the average English speaker is about 20,000 words. The King James Version of the Bible was written with a total vocabulary of around 12,000 words. So one of the things it was the King James put together a committee. It's one of the greatest works of art prepared by a committee. Art by committee is rarely successful, but this is one of the real success stories, the greatest probably. 52 poets and scholars, and their whole task was to present the most faithful translation that was the most accessible to the common man. It was written for the common man in the common tongue. And that's why you see so many phrases from the King James Version still 400 years later being part of our daily parlance.
Right.
So I don't know if I got to that got out of the realm of memory, but I think the takeaway for me is that there's a very different thing. There's so many different parts of memory,
Yes.
And for that thing particularly, hearing is actually for a language, for a language that is different but mutually intelligible, so a different dialect. Hearing it is so much easier, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, when you say that you had a difficult time reading it, I was thinking, listening to you, I mean, didn't I see that you played it in the Duchess of Malfi? I mean, isn't Webster the most difficult thing to read? I mean, and I don't know what my question is around it, but like I've read theories that Shakespeare, for example, people just caught keywords in the audience because it was so loud with rubble and ramble and all this sort of stuff going on in the audiences, that it really was never about some sort of verbatim delivery that everybody was going to scan and track every single word, but rather it's almost like they're picking up the story in the way that apparently now they're asking, Hollywood people to write scripts differently so that they're actually less engaging and more based around just like little keywords that pop up every so often, because people are actually, you know,
They're not
they're
watching.
not watching at all. They're kind of like a
That's
Shakespearean audience where it's actually the market and they're trading their clamshells and all this sort of stuff, and it's all just become keyword based again. And so it's a lot of bump, I guess they would say, in some parts of the world, and then just in any case, again, I don't know that I
yeah.
have a
So
question, but I'm just sort of thinking through
no,
like,
that's I could speak to that,
mm,
and obviously I wasn't there and you weren't there.
mm,
Um, I think there's I think the truth to that does not agree with the conclusion of that theory, if that makes any sense. I think that that's a hot hypothesis based on a true thing
mm.
about writing. That, but you know, I don't know if you've ever written anything. I know you're a musician, but if you've written anything, you want people to read every word and hear every note, you
Right, right.
know. And whether you are the background entertainment or not, and I I used to be a stand-up comedian. I once got booked on a gig at a strip club, and I didn't realize before I went out on stage that they weren't going to take the dancers off the stage
Right, right, right.
or turn down the music. I was like, they didn't turn it off. They turned it down, but I was like, can you turn it off? And they were like, some of these dancers have no rhythm, so they really need the music.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know, um, and obviously I'm a long way from doing stand-up comedy in a strip club. I'm doing the King James, I'm doing the gospel according to Mark, mostly in churches. So people grow, but you know I wanted all my jokes to be heard, and I
Mm,
found the one person in the audience who would listen to me, and I did a show for one person, you know
yeah.
and the people who wanted to pay attention did, and the people who didn't want to pay attention didn't. But the performer and the writer, and which in this case of stand-up comedy is the same person, made sure that someone heard each and every word.
Right.
That said, the thing about the keywords is very interesting. And so I'll tell you a different thing about that time, which I think is, this must be something that you're constantly reminding people of, is that the exercise of memory is a cultural habit that can result in wildly different memory capacities across a population. And so back then, when we had to rely on our ears and our eyes to remember everything, and most people were illiterate and couldn't check what was written, um, the capacity for oral memory was extraordinary. And the reason actually that a roll is called a roll is that because there were no copyright laws, people would send people in to memorize plays by listening to them once.
Yeah.
There, and this was a profession people had. Now, obviously, there's degrees of talent here, and some people were probably great at it, and some people were probably worse. It's probably a bell curve of distribution. But everyone within that bell curve is way at the end of the bell curve for nowadays, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So the way that playwrights defended against this is they would never give, and actors were always broke. And since money was made off the plays, you didn't want to give the script to an actor who'd go, yeah, I'll read this, and then go sell it to the next producer. So what they would do is, first of all, they would identify the people who would go in and memorize the plays and beat them up or pay them more money or whatever it was. But on the off chance that the actors would sell the script, they never gave any actor the whole script, but they gave them a scroll
Mm.
that just had their lines and their cue lines on it. And that role, that's where role comes from. So
Yeah.
you would learn your lines and not know the other characters' lines until you went into the rehearsal period. And this was a way of defending against this fact that there was no copyright law at the time. But yeah, that was a thing, and some people think that's where some of the bad copies of Shakespeare come from. Like they might send two people in, you memorize the first half, memorize the second half, stuff like that.
Mm.
But the thing about Shakespeare is that if you ask any actor, would you rather memorize the prose or the poetry, right, or the verse? They're always going to say the verse because the structure of the verse helps you remember. And one of the main tools, and he used this in prose too, but one of what Shakespeare is absolutely the best at of all those people who were writing at that time is the juxtaposition of opposites, right?
Yeah.
So in a verse line, you might have the context of, someone's angry and hot and someone else is sullen and cold.
Mm.
So it is true that when you're communicating it, one thing that'll happen to an untrained Shakespearean actor is that they'll try to emphasize every word, and you get bogged down in all this text. And I think some people hear bad Shakespeare and they go, "There's a lot of extra words in there," but an interesting uh, exercise to do if you're an actor, and they make you do this, in Shakespeare school. They say the first thing you have to do is write your own paraphrase of every speech you have. So put it in your own words. And the interesting thing is, your paraphrase almost always ends up being more words than what Shakespeare uses. So what happens is that uh, he is always developing the story. And I think when we have modern actors come in who tend in TV and film to sort of play a quality rather than a choice, they say, "Oh, I'm going to be sad in this scene," and then everything is the same tone, you know. And so
And
all those words don't really matter. But when you have someone who comes in and says, "Okay, here's where Shakespeare is indicating to me that there is a choice change and that the argument is being developed, or the story is being furthered, or the stakes are being raised," then all of those words become necessary. So both are true. He uses what we call operative words in classical text analysis to carry the meaning, and you're taught as an actor to skip along the other words and lift the operative words. So I think that's the truth in that theory,
mm.
but I think all the words are necessary. But it's also true that in a distracting environment, you can follow the story
Right.
just hearing the operative words. So
Maybe
any other?
oh, go ahead.
No. I have other mnemonic devices of Shakespeare which you may have encountered.
Oh, I want to ask all kinds of questions around this. I was just thinking of like what would be an example of an operative word, and then I was thinking I know a line or two of Shakespeare, so and I have a
Lay it on
question.
me.
I have a question around this, whether it's an
Sure.
operative word or not. But when we get into textual analysis, I believe I've seen this both ways. But oh, for a
Hmm.
muse of fire that could ascend the brightest heaven of invention, kingdom for a stage, princess to act, muses to behold our swelling scene, right? So I think I've seen it as oh, for a muse of fire that could ascend, and I think I've seen it oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend, right? So I don't know like what a director would want to say about that, or if that's an operative difference. But to me, I think it's fascinating that could and would like do so much to change what the muse might be saying there at the beginning of Henry V, if that's Henry V.
Oh, give me the line again. Yeah, it is.
Okay, so I'm not trying to act it because I have no acting training, but I think it is.
I'm not judging you.
Well, I'd like to be judged though, because it'd be fun. But I think it's "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold our swelling scene."
It's so funny, you know. It would never occur to me. I mean, obviously, the meaning changes slightly between could and would.
Mm.
And could, I think, I'm just sort of scanning it in my head, is in the stressed position. But there's a rank, and all the rules that are connected to textual analysis in Shakespeare really are guidelines. You know,
Right.
you can't, I don't think you should get religion about it, but you know, you connect to the story as an actor. You say, what's happening in the scene? What's the emotional line? What does my character want? And all that. And then you go into deeper into the, you know, line by line text, and you go, well, what is Shakespeare telling me about what's happening here?
Mm.
Anyway, we generally have a word category order that we observe, and if you're looking for operative words, you're almost always looking for verbs first.
Mm. Right.
So could is a helper within a verb, right? And it is in the stressed position. But to me, ascend
That's the word, right?
is what carries this image of this soaring screen, you
Mm.
know, that could, or this expanding stage that could encapsulate the whole world. You know, he's talking about, it's interesting, he's in the Renaissance anticipating the extraordinary explosion of inventive power that's coming in the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. He kind of, you know, he's seeing where all the clockmaker stuff and all the learning that's being concentrated in universities right now is going to explode into a much more direct mode of communication that can reach millions at a time. He's sort of seeing all this stuff, you know.
Right.
So that elan, that movement, that soaring feeling lives in ascend, right? It's climbing up to heaven, right? And here's another thing we look for. Shakespeare often end loads the meaning. So the end of the verse line is very important. And if you know where the verse line is heading, so what's the end of the verse line?
Monarchs to behold our swelling scene. I mean, I don't know that I'm interpreting what verse line means necessarily, but
So it's written in blank verse, which is generally iambic pentameter, right? So that's 5 feet of iambs, which is 2 beats, right? Which is unstressed stress, ba bum ba bum ba bum, right?
right.
So I hear could ascend, and I'm hearing the end of 1 foot. That's a stress. Send, right? That's the stress, right? So just give me the line again, because I'll find the end of the verse line for you. Oh, for a muse of fire.
Yeah,
I should
we should also admit that maybe I've just misremembered something wrong and I've confused
no
myself.
no no
So
no.
maybe it is
It
wood
sounds
and
right.
could, or maybe it is could, but there never was a wood. But in any case, I'll try it this way. Oh, for a muse of fire that could ascend the brightest heaven. I don't know why I have to roll my R. The brightest heaven of invention. Kingdom
Ah,
for a stage,
yeah.
princes to act, and muses to
So
behold our swelling scene.
heaven of invention,
Mm.
right? So to me, the operative word, since I'm ending in heaven, right?
Right,
The verb that gets me there is ascend.
right.
So that's what I mean by an operative word, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, that we, you know, oh, that we had the muse is the technical aspects of the theater, right? And they're all slow and mechanical and hard and heavy. But what if we had one of fire, that could
Right.
change into any shape, you know, all this stuff. Anyway, but if you're breaking it down and you're looking for operative words, you want to go with verbs, and after that, nouns. And what a lot of actors, particularly American actors, don't want to do is hit the pronouns. Pronouns are always last unless there's a direct comparison,
Mm.
right? Because what you want to look for is the words that carry the meaning. And so conjunctions almost never carry the meaning. It's usually verbs and nouns.
Right. Right.
So in this sense, in this case, ascend, heaven, right?
Mm.
And then heaven of invention is sort of a phrasal noun in a sense, right? Because it's not any kind of heaven, it's specifically a heaven of invention.
Mm.
So you generally don't want to overstress your line. So I would say ascend, heaven, invention for three. Three is a little heavy. If you can get away with two, that's good. But there's a lot of little things in Shakespeare but that can be a mnemonic as well, right? You
Mm.
don't have much difficulty remembering heaven if you know you're ascending to heaven,
Right.
right? And if you know the muse is if you know the muse is the mode of creativeness, then you
Mm.
know that's connected to invention. So you know that these words are referring to each other, and I think a lot of what you do, I haven't dug too much into the materials yet, but I haven't been enjoying the free videos. Thank you. Um, I think a lot of what you do is making connections. Is sort of this. There's this paradox of adding more information to retain information,
Mm.
and so a lot of memorizing verse is about going, oh, well, this verb connects to this noun at the end of the scene, at the end of the sentence. It carries me into the next phrase,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, and in the next phrase, you have these wonderful parallels. So it's
It's like a
what
rule
for
of
a play,
threes. Um,
the rule of threes, but it's also parallels, right?
Kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to
Kingdom for
behold.
a stage,
Yeah.
right? So so kingdom, princes. What's the third thing?
Monarchs.
Monarchs, right?
Mm.
So those things all go together. But we're creating an alternate world where we have a muse of fire, right?
Right.
And the kingdom, and that's a stage. Princes for a what?
Princes to act, I think.
Princes to act. Monarchs,
To behold our swelling scene.
right? So he's creating a parallel between the temporal world of political power, kingdoms, princes, monarchs,
Mm.
to the theatrical world, stage, actors, audience, right?
Right.
um, so all of those things, once you see the parallel, and those would be lines that's over full of operative words because you have to get that opposition, right?
Right.
um, and another thing that Shakespeare uses is, which I'm sure you've dealt with, is chiasmus.
Mm. Indeed.
So a lot of the monologues, and I had a friend actually who wrote a paper on this. There's a lot of theories that Shakespeare didn't write his stuff, right?
You know, Edward de Vere is never far from here, if I can make a bad rhyme.
I don't really credit it, but I had a friend who answered that question in a very interesting way. He went in and he analyzed Shakespeare's use of chiasmic structures
Mm.
in his writing, and he was able to chart the development of his use of chiasmus. It got more and more complex over time, and he contends that, like in one of Lear's speeches, that you can find the heart of the speech, the point of it, at the chiasmic center of it,
Mm.
right? Like this is the point. Now you go into the heart and you come back out by the same direction.
Mm.
It's developing. It's not repetitive, but it is repetitive in the sense of like you're walking back along the same track, having made a discovery with a new perspective on all the same stuff. And so, anyway, his argument is that if you look at Shakespeare's use of chiasmus and compare it to other writers, his is so much more complex and so consistent and develops to such a high degree that it essentially constitutes a literary signature. And he actually says, okay, so this play that we know was written part by him and part by somebody, Fletcher, but we don't know which parts. He goes, look at the chiasmatic structures in this part. That's Shakespeare. They don't appear in the other part. That's Fletcher.
Yeah.
So he uses that a lot. And I think the interesting thing about chiasmus, and I wonder what your perspective on this is, it's such an ancient mnemonic technique that I wonder, and I wonder if this isn't true for all mnemonic techniques, that it doesn't parallel some sort of brain structure. Like it acts, not a brain structure, but something fundamental about how the mind works.
Mm.
You know, um, but anyway, because I think even if you're not aware of the chiasmatic structure, that it can help you remember. I don't know if you agree with that.
Not only would I agree, but I've written an entire book about this. And you asked me if I've ever written and had the ego so large that I expected everybody to read over every word. But I'll save that for later when we're off camera, and I'll tell you about it. But my audience certainly knows about it, and it actually has
Yeah.
the phrase coincidenta oppositorum in it, which I'm thinking of Coleridge, of course, and Coleridge is thinking of Shakespeare. And so, yeah, I don't know how far I would go into because it'd be out of my lane to be like, oh yeah, deep in the brainstem for sure. There is this sort of
Yeah,
structure.
yeah, yeah.
But if we think both at the like deeply difficult to contend with Lacanian psychoanalysis stuff relative to Carl Jung, relative to how that Peter Gay talks about where exactly the moment was that Freud picked up the Oedipus complex. I mean, this idea that something about how that we process the world is chiasmatic, or and this I think is the great contribution that Nietzsche made, and why Freud was worried that people would think he was just ripping off Nietzsche, which at the Vienna Convention he literally said, I don't want anybody to go think that I'm just plagiarizing Nietzsche here. And Jung later talks about cryptomnesia and the problem of forgetting where you read something and thinking
Yeah.
that you produced this idea
Thinking
originally
enough
on
with
your
it.
own, right? Which
That's so
now,
funny. There's a
anyway,
great Shakespeare quote about people who only got the tune of the times but never understood the melody or something like that.
right, right.
And I can never remember where it is.
Is it maybe Sonnet 59? It has the records going around the sun in Sonnet 59. I only memorize the opening where it's like, if there be nothing new but that which is hath been before, how are our brains beguiled? And then the next line after that, I think, is where he talks about the everything that's been recorded is going around. If it goes around the sun 500 times or something like that, like it will just keep returning and so forth. I should remember the whole sonnet because it is a deep reflection on the impossibility of originality, um, and yet the paradox in which all our utterances are utterly unique. Well, how could they
Yes.
be otherwise? So we're kind of in well, Nietzsche calls it the eternal return of the same. But the sameness is actually ontologically built out of difference,
Hmm.
so to speak.
I'm gonna have to chew on that, but I like it. I like it.
It's definitely chewable, but whether it leads to, you know, something that's true, that's its own conversation.
Well, but it resonates with me as an actor because this is always what good acting teachers are telling you is that the more specific you become, the more universal the appeal of what you're doing is.
Mm,
Because
okay.
people recognize truth, um, and they know the difference between truth and artifice. And, a lot of technology has been bent towards trying to replace truth with artifice, and it hadn't worked yet. I mean, perhaps by degrees it will improve. Um, but to me, that's why I think live theater will always be relevant, because it's not just the moment, the true moment that I'm having with the camera, it's the true moment that I'm having with you in the space, you
Right.
know. And as far as memory goes, for me, that becomes which line am I going to blow up tonight because I connected with an audience member in a way I never had before, and I had a new moment, and suddenly this map that I have in my head has a new distracting feature.
Right. Right. Right.
And I'm like, where am I? What side of the Sea of Galilee am I on? Um, but the interesting thing about that is that the problem then becomes a thing I remember. You know what I'm
Right.
saying?
I do, I think, anyway.
So I'm like saying, I'll be coming up to a line and go, I blew this last time,
Yes. Okay. Yeah. In that sense.
Which line was it? And then boom, it's there.
Right. Well, how do you
So,
deal with that? I mean, how do you just not become a total twitchy, nervous wreck, given the high possible rate of mistakes that one could make, and then knowing that the mistake can be ingrained in memory? Do you do relaxation exercises to be an actor, or how does that all work?
yeah, I mean, it's funny. I guess I think I got into this to try and change literally everything about myself. So I was painfully shy,
Right.
high anxiety, over intellectual. So I think I got into this to, try and be outgoing and heart centered and not anxious. And it's, I've had degrees of success.
Right. Right.
But it's a project. Um, Anxiety is interesting for a performer, and as a performer, I'm sure you know this. If you're not anxious before a show, it's not going to be a good show. I mean, there's obviously a difference in degree between shutting down, and not being able to function.
Mm.
Um, but I think, so one of the things that I say to people when they say, "Hey, how did you memorize this?" And I wasn't, I mean, I was a good student, but I was not a great student. And I don't have great focus. And so it's very hard I'm a very slow reader, which kind of kept me from being an academic, I think, because sort of the first semester I got to school and I realized I just can't handle this reading load. It's
Right.
sort of, you can skate on cleverness in high school, and then you get to college and you go, oh, well, there's not enough time for me to do all this reading, you know. So I'm not necessarily the best candidate for having memorized all this stuff. But when people ask me, how did you do it? I say, fear.
Well,
you know,
I
total
have,
fear. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you exactly where that fear comes from. Is the first time I did it as a dramatic reading,
mm,
I had a lady sitting in the front row whose name was Marianne Nunnally, who was in the public school system in New Hanover County for 50 years. She had every job from, kindergarten school teacher all the way up to superintendent. I mean, and she was a serious church lady. And I came in with my old practice Bible here, and you can actually see where the book of Mark is based on
wow.
which pages are tattered the most here. I came in and I was doing my reading, and she sat down in the front row with her own Bible and was checking me word for word. And I was trying to lift it off the page and, act it a little bit, but it was still a dramatic reading. And you have to go at a certain pace,
Mm,
or else it ends up being 2.5 hours. I mean, if it's really pacey, it's about 90 minutes of text. That's what it should be. And you
right.
really have to get a clip to do that. And so I knew before I ever did my first off book performance that there would be people in the audience looking at the text while I was doing it.
Mm.
And there would also be people, so it's sort of interesting story for me is that, I didn't come to this as a believer, hadn't been raised in the church or whatever. Um, you know, so I was very aware that I was presenting something that was the most important thing in many of my audience members' lives. And so I took it as a tremendous responsibility to be faithful and respectful to the intent of the text, as I was able to perceive. The cats are demanding entry, so they're just going to continue doing that. They're just going to continue scratching if I don't let them in. I don't know if they'll make an appearance.
Well, let's hope so. It wouldn't be much of a cameo without some visuals.
Right, right. Otherwise, it's just the mystery cat.
Right, right.
Um, but so I think that so this is a way of talking about this anxiety issue, which is what are the stakes?
Mm,
And I think maybe for me, the answer to how I change those stakes from anxiety to purpose and drive is that I have to recognize the stakes ultimately are not about me.
right.
There's something very self-directed about anxiety. What are they going to think of me? Am I going to embarrass myself? Am I going to this or that? You know, and so I am a believer now. Spending a lot of time with the Word did convict me. Um, and what I pray for before every performance is to be of service. You know,
Right.
so for me, and I don't. For me, that's how I transform that nervous energy into a good performance, because I'm literally representing the most important thing in someone's life to many of the people in my audience. Um, yeah, and that actually, to speak about it a little farther, when I first decided to get off book, I knew eventually I had to do it, but I was just terrified by the task, because how do you do it?
Mm.
Um, well, hang on. Let me get back. Let me answer the original question so we don't lose it. So there's a couple things. You you get a lot of grace from an audience, and not just a Christian audience. You get a lot of grace from an audience when the material is truthful, and meaningful. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily true with a bad script, but this certainly isn't the case here. You get a lot of grace for really being in the story,
Mm.
you know, um, and even people. So I've had people be. So there's a couple things. Most of the people aren't going to be on book. The people who are on book, um, I think, are going to be impressed, even if I have, over the course of, as you say, 10,000 plus words, 100 mistakes. A
Mm.
hundred mistakes over 10,000 words. I if I were in a memory competition, I'm sure I'd get flagged. I know for sure there's little mistakes in there. There's things. So one of the things that I found really difficult to remember, um, is that when there's a different grammar with different rules, um, and sometimes inconsistent rules, you have to figure out if there is a convention. So sometimes the book will say, "And he said." Sometimes the book will say, "And Jesus said." Sometimes it'll say, "He said to." Sometimes it'll say, "He said unto."
Mm.
Within all those words, to stop on a certain point and go, "Oh, I know it's to and not unto here." that's pretty tough. However, what you do is you find which is the minority and you focus on that, right? So you assume the rule is unto, and then when two comes in, either you try to find a reason for it, and this is sort of connects back to that list of 13 words that I gave you. Either you try to find a reason for it, or you just go, this is where one of the twos is. And there's another, sometimes he says, sometimes the book says, and Jesus answered and said unto them, right? So those are probably the ones on which I'll make the most mistakes. That one I figured out. He always said, it always says, and Jesus answered and said unto them, if there's an ask preceding that. But it's not always the case. Sometimes he answered and said unto them when there was no ask preceding that. But again, that's just something that you have to identify and try and pick up every time. And what I do is I'll go back and I run it in my head often, usually when I'm walking. But every once in a while, I go back and I read through the text, just read it again. And I read it out loud because, again, for me, hearing it is what brings it alive. And there is a certain, it's very poetically written. It's beautiful language. And there's a certain music to it. And often hearing the word will make me go, wait a minute. The sentence I said just made sense. I've delivered all the information in the correct order, but there's some little part of it that's missing. And that gets back to, like, I think what was surprising to me and what's been surprising to me as an actor, it's the power of repetition. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's shortcuts where you don't have to do as much repetition. But for me, sometimes I'm not even thinking about it. It's like how it feels in my mouth. Yeah. Like if I try to go, even to the extent where if I try to go through a phrase more slowly than I normally do, I won't remember it. Right. Now, actors might say, well, you're locked into a choice and da da da. And it's like, okay, you know what? You want to play it differently every time you do it? Show me how it's done. Right. And the truth is, I'll tell you this. So I don't worry about the fact that I probably have 100 little mistakes in every performance. I may get some wrong notes, but the whole concert gets played every time. Right. So I just know that's going to happen, and I know that I'm given grace if I'm doing a good job presenting the information. But I also, regularly go back and identify. Like, it's very strange because I'll make a mistake and then I'll be doing the next scene going, I did something wrong back there, right. And you can't focus on it too much in the moment or you screw up the next moment, and it all cascades out. But sometimes when you make a mistake, sometimes you don't. And ultimately, unless I were to hire someone to check me on book every time, I just kind of have to check myself, and it's imperfect. But it is what it is, and I get the job done. I mean, as far as big things, so I generally, when I first started doing the show, I would always have someone on book, for just the moment that I was talking about, when I have a reaction, and maybe a great reaction from an audience member, maybe a wonderful moment of connection between me and the audience, which is one of the reasons I stage it in the round, so that I'm not in proscenium. It's not me opposite the audience. I'm not above them. I'm on the same level. I'm moving in between them. I'm touching them. I'm endowing them as characters and having conversations with them, all this stuff. That's what I love to have happen. Sometimes it happens and I forget what's happening next. And when that happens, and I'll set this, convention up. They used to have these little hoods at the front of the stage with a guy that had a script, and the
Right.
actors could call for a line in the middle of the performance. So I just set that up. I say, hey, look, I may call a line. Um, but more and more when I do it, my wife used to come to the performances and do it, but more and more if I'm traveling, she can't come, and trying to get someone at the venue to be on book for you and explaining sort of how to jump in unobtrusively and then jump back out. Um, I've ended up doing it more and more with no safety net like that.
Mm.
Um, and the best one ever was, Jesus crosses the Sea of Galilee many times. And sometimes you'll get into that boat in chapter 3 and come out of that boat on chapter 7. So I had these two boys, Luke and they're going to kill me for forgetting their names. Luke and Paul, and they were wonderful boys who were on book for me at this church show I was doing.
Quite
And I
appropriate
did.
names for our topic, actually.
Yes, exactly. They were my they were two of my apostles for sure, and they were on book for me. And I got into the boat in one chapter and came out of the boat in a totally different. And I had skipped like 4 chapters, and I paused, and I hate calling for line. And I said, you know what, I can't. I'm so far off. I know I've missed huge chunks here. I don't know what's happening, right? I just got totally thrown. And I said, line. And then from the back of the room, all you heard was just the desperate flipping of pages. And so it was obvious, and that was one of the best laughs I ever got. I mean, I didn't get it, but I was there for it.
Mm.
Just it wasn't a sight gag, it was a sound gag.
Right, right.
The gag of how many pages I had just totally missed. And that laugh broke the anxiety for me, because often what happens in the moment when you forget is you have that oh no moment, and everything in your head just goes white, and there's no last thing I can grab onto. There's no signposts where I can get my orientation. You're just in that white panic space.
Mm.
And that laugh loosened me up. And I just said, first of all, I just acknowledged it. I said, that's the sound of me skipping about 3 chapters. And it got a big laugh. And I said, I believe where I got into the boat was, and it all came back just because I relaxed.
Mm.
That was yes. I've had the moments of sheer terror in the middle of a performance, but I think again you get grace for being the person who has the guts to go up there and do it. And it's almost like one of the things I've learned is that the high wire act is much more interesting when the person walking the rope teeters and totters.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I'm not yet confident enough to manufacture a totter, but when they happen, I have enough, sort of experience to go, okay, well, this is how you deal with it.
Right, right. No, that's
And
very good.
sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say that's very good stuff. I mean, I have manufactured some teetering and tottering in my career. I was a card magician for quite some time, and Magician in Trouble is
Uh-huh.
one of the ne plus ultra of, card magic, where you really sell that you've made a mistake, but it's got the other dimension too, which is jazzing
Yeah.
when you you really have made a mistake that you didn't plan for, but because you know how you're going to get out of it, you still kind of have to act that you're getting out of it. So it's just kind of this, it's very
Oh,
Brechtian
that's
in a way. It's got a
hilarious.
Verfremdungs effect to it. So,
Jazzing. I
yeah.
love it. I love it.
That's not
I
my
have
term,
a
actually. I think it comes from Michael Close, who is a legend in what's called mem deck work or memorized deck magic. And so, anyway, I don't want to take credit for that term because it's used quite a bit in card magic world.
Jazzing. I love it. And I love the manufactured moments. As an actor, I've been in shows where, and it's sort of an old vaudeville thing, which is why it makes sense that it happens in magic too,
Mm.
is, you know, you'll be talking to your scene partner in a comedy and say, what do you think about breaking it up here? And that's where you pretend that one of you has been so funny, or one of you has made a mistake, or something unexpected has happened, that as actors you actually break. There was it was a Marx Brothers. They did a stage version of a Marx Brothers show, and the guy playing Groucho was absolutely hysterical. But they had a bit where his scene partner can't go on with the scene because he's laughing too hard, and the guy playing Groucho pulls out, looks at his watch and starts doing material about how the guy can't, they pay him too much, he's not unprofessional and all that.
Mm.
So yeah, it's a high level maneuver, because if you don't sell it, you completely lose the trust of the audience.
Right.
So you must have been a pretty good magician to sell those, and a decent actor. You got to be a good actor, right?
Well, I don't know, but I had a lot of fun, and I've seen fun reflected in other people's faces. So, but
That's
I'm not a
that's the
magician
method.
anymore, or at least not a performing one at the moment. But I think about it a
So
lot. Go ahead.
so one of the, speaking about the Sea of Galilee and things that I've used. So I mean, to remember, the main thing obviously is imagination. That's pretty obvious. But the more vivid the images I can get, um, but the better. But also for me, and why I think I would have more trouble memorizing other gospels, is that when you get deep into the gospel according to Mark, there are no non sequiturs.
Mm.
There appear to be non sequiturs, and it because there's so many transitions that start with and then, and when we use and, it's part of sort of a list of things that doesn't necessarily have a direction or a meaning. Um, there, the and does not indicate that. Um, in that gospel, um, everything happens in a meaningful sequence. Um, and if it didn't, my job would be to create a meaningful sequence to lay under it.
Okay.
So, first of all, you know, um, first of all, it's seeing very clearly what the sequence of events is. It's connecting emotionally to what's happening in those scenes, and I mean, for higher stakes, more palpable stuff, you can't do better. I mean, for goodness sake, you've got people being healed of lifelong sicknesses. You've got demons being exorcised. You've got, a crucifixion. You've got, all these things going on. And also some very precise rhetorical work when Jesus is jousting with the Pharisees. And of course, rhetoric and logic have their own internal structure to them, which are very helpful. So if you really get the back and forth of the argument, like this is your position and this is how he answers it, and you go through that way, it's impossible. If you understand the whole argument, it's impossible to get lost in it, you
Mm.
know. And then physically, from a lot, I think there's maybe, I don't know, 15 characters that I actually inhabit. Not all the apostles are named, but maybe over the course of the show, 15 characters that I inhabit. And a lot of them I have one line or two lines
Mm.
to inhabit this person. So I have to make a pretty broad physical, vocal, and energetic choice. And again, those are armatures on which or maybe that's the wrong word. Those are, beacons of memory for me. You know,
Yeah,
there's a father who's sort of using his child as the prophet debunker. He's got this child who just can't can't be healed. And whenever the Pharisees want to undercut some prophet who's coming around healing people, they bring this kid out, and then Jesus heals him. And the father has this transformation on the dime. He comes out and he's very boastful, and he's like, "Your disciples couldn't cast him out, you know, and then when Jesus addresses him, he says, how long have you been letting, you're his father, right? How long have you let this go on? And on a dime, this guy is on his knees begging for Jesus to save his son, you know? Um, and that moment for an actor, it's one of those things where it's like, wait a minute, how do I change so quickly? And what you have to do is you have to connect to a moment in time in your life, if you've had such a moment, and the older you get, unfortunately, the more of it you have, where your whole world is changed in a moment in a profound way, you know? And so it sort of transitions from being like a place of anxiety, like, how am I going to do this, to, oh my gosh, I get to represent this. um, and that's in classic Greek theater, that moment, and it's rarely given in most dramas to a minor character. It's usually the moment that's given to the tragic hero, is the moment of self recognition, anagnoresis,
mm.
right? And
Can't have
this
it
little
without peripeteia.
what is peripeteia again?
Reversal. You can. I think you can have recognition without reversal, but bad joke. Sorry.
Reversal. No, no, no. That's a great one too.
Mm,
Where your whole, as you say, where the whole reality changes. But this guy has the moment of recognition.
mm,
He realizes that, oh, I've actually been participating in my son's suffering. I've gotten so calloused by the years of suffering that I just said, you know what? I'm just going to make money off of this. What else can I do?
mm,
Instead of never giving up faith in my son and doing everything I could to heal him, you know. And Jesus says, it's all on you, man, and he's got just a few lines, you know. um, but it's this huge emotional event. So all of those things, and there's no scene in this show, and I'm not disrespectful when I say a show. It's just, for me, I'm doing it as a play. There's no scene in this story that doesn't have a tremendous emotional event. So those things are easy to remember, because I'm experiencing them on a lot of different levels. I have the voice for that character, I have the body for that character, I have the energy, and then I have that emotional event. And all those things are layering on top of each other to help me remember. And then one thing I did too, because I'm going across the Sea of Galilee so many times, I put I do the show in the round, and I have two aisles in the form of a cross. It's broad, but it works.
right, right.
It's on the nose, but there it is. It works. Two aisles going through the audience, so the audience is cut into four wedges, and I run in and around, and there's 12 chairs in the center for my disciples. I have the 13th chair, which I sometimes pull to the edge, and I sit with them, like at the Last Supper and all this, right? Um, but the track that I take around, and I have, the mountain behind me, and the mountain is also the high place where Pilate speaks from at the when he's at the feast where he's trying to release Jesus, but they choose to release Barabbas instead. and I have, the crypt over here, and I have, this town over there and that town over there and all this stuff. So I actually, the blocking is another thing that then helps me, right?
Right.
So I don't that often get lost going from one side of the Sea of Galilee to the other, because usually when I land, I go, wait a minute, I'm here for this crossing, not this crossing. So I've tried to put as many sort of little things into the set that will help me remember where I am in my physical track, which I mean, that's kind of the basis of the memory palace, right? In
Mm.
the first place. So
Right.
I have my track through the mansion. Unfortunately, I recross my steps all the time. But it still helps.
Yeah, yeah.
That's about it, I think. Oh, and then do you remember the list of 13 things?
Do I remember the list of 13 things? Which 13
13
things?
sins. Remember the
Oh, the
13 sins I
sins, the
sent you?
sins. Oh, was I supposed to memorize them? I guess I was. No, I didn't get around to it. I was I have no apology for this.
No, no, no.
If I had meant
Well,
to,
but
or
you had told me that you had said I would use, and you used a phrase for what kind of technique you would use.
for the 13 sins, I mean, one of the things that is interesting to think about is like what's the context, and is it just that you want to be able to rattle it off, or is it in the larger part of delivering, or is it both? So let me try and see if I can excavate things in my memory here of what we were talking about, and look at it this way, just in reference to something that I have done that relates maybe. So when I gave a TEDx talk, I memorized it in a memory palace, and it's pretty much verbatim. But there's a part of the memory palace where I quote stuff that's in another memory palace. So I sort
Oh,
of
wow.
portal it in. But
How
here's the
cool.
problem that I think that is missed again and again and again, and I think you've just transcended it, and you essentially have described like the limits of the memory palace, but also its strengths when you talk about blocking. So that is the Mary Palace technique in many, many ways. When I'm here, this is, representing this, and these would be the lines that are here. But the thing about what I'm teaching with the Mary Palace technique is that we use the Mary Palace to get it into long-term memory so that the palace is irrelevant. So when I actually delivered my TEDx talk, I am not in a memory palace. I'm not referring to a memory palace. I could care less about the memory palace. I'm just reciting it from long-term memory, both the Sanskrit that I quote Aldous Huxley, I quote Eckhart Tolle, I quote ancient Sanskrit and stuff like that, and it's just coming because it's in long-term memory, right?
Yeah,
So if it says 13 sins, if I want to just memorize that list, I'm going to use a memory palace, but I might use a memory palace with a pillar technique, or I might use a memory palace with a body inside of it where the body has 13 stations. I may use just a linear journey. But if it's going to be part of the book of Mark, let's say, I actually honestly don't know how I would approach the book of Mark exactly, or whatever book these 13 sins are coming into, or where that would be useful. It would be irrelevant whether it's in a memory palace or not, because my work is going to be to have it in long-term memory. And it's the same thing with memorized deck work. So I have decks that are in memory. There's a Tamariz stack, there's a Redford stack, there's all kinds of different stacks, right? And they have different purposes. There's even very simple ones like the Cy Stebbins stack. And it's just like, it's irrelevant because I need to be able to hold those in long-term memory without referring to a memory palace. But if I do a certain routine and I need to know 6 cards that have just come out, I'm going to use their body as a memory palace in real time right then if I want to memorize them. Or if I want to memorize a deck in front of people, which I've done as a demonstration, then I'm going to use a memory palace. And then it's going to be very important in that short-term context that I can hold it in the memory palace during the
So you
demonstration.
right, you're placing, holding, and repeating all within the demonstration. So that's the speed of it. That's
Yeah.
extraordinary. That's
And
extraordinary. Well, and you know, what you said about long-term memory resonates with me because I've been with this text for a while now, and sometimes I'll just get busy and not even think about it for a month, and I'll go, I should go take a walk.
mm,
And
solvitur
it,
ambulando.
and it, and it just comes out. And
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't get how this is sticking in there.
Mm.
Actually, today I went and spaced on a line that I hadn't spaced on in a long time. So I imagine there is some sort of soft math about periodization, like how long you need to go in between revisiting things, like how often you need to refresh. And
Mm.
I don't know if if the period gets longer and then sort of, like you need to, like, I know if I didn't, it used to be if I didn't run it once a week, I would not feel good about it, you know. Now I probably run it once a month and that's about it,
Yeah.
but there's been times when I've gone longer and come back to it. So I'm always so, I think without understanding that I was putting it into a place from which it would not easily get dislodged, I did, just by doing it so many times.
Oh yeah.
That it
Well, it is exactly soft math. And there's principles like state dependence or context dependence. So one could anticipate that if you were using the same theater for 5 weeks and then you didn't do it for 5 months, by doing it in the same theater that you did it in for 5 weeks, as opposed to the one you only did it once, in 1933 or whatever, you're not that old, but, or not old at all. But, the point is like state dependence and context dependent memory, those terms are very similar. It would give you an additional boost because you
for
had
sure.
had done it in that area. Um, but in terms of
Yeah,
like people who want harder math, Dominic O'Brien for years has talked about the rule of five. And I personally need it to be a little bit more robust than the way that he describes it, depending on what it is I'm memorizing. But the rule of five is generally like once a week or once a day for 5 days, once a week for 5 weeks, once a month for 5 months, that sort of thing. And
yeah,
this Shakespeare line that I quoted, I'm not thinking of the memory palace when I say it to you at all. But if when I was memorizing it and I knew I wanted to hold that because I just love the line, like Derek Jacobi is ringing in my head, even maybe it's a little fantasy that I could one day even say one word as good as he says words. But
it's so
uh,
amazing.
I wanted to hold it. So I did something like the rule of five, like once a day for every five for 5 days and then once a week for 5 weeks. And now it's just kind of natural. Now, how long that it's going to last, nobody knows. That's the softest math of all. But my
Sure.
passion will for it and using it will be part of it. And if I have
Part of it.
to, I can think to the memory palace and I can go, oh yes, that was by the door and I literally had a monarch butterfly by the plant because it's monarchs, not royalty, that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Well, so, you started with the word context.
Mm.
And so everything I just said about how I attribute meaning to everything that I memorize, and that is what allows me to memorize it, to make sense of it, to make a story out of it, to make a palpable feeling out of it. That's why I found I had panic about this particular list because I couldn't make any sense of it.
Mm.
So the list is evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness.
Mm.
It's a strange list, you know? I mean,
Yeah.
like, this is the Son of God, right? And he's making a list of 13 sins. So, A, you would think that it wouldn't be repetitive, right? you would think like maybe it would be, full of the worst ones, or maybe it would be in some order of degree, but it's not. Murder's somewhere in the middle, and foolishness is at the end, and evil thoughts are at the beginning. And it's like, what is the sense of this list? You
Right.
know, um, and
Well,
and go ahead.
I was just going to say, I haven't yet found. I probably said maybe I'll remember it for this, but I don't remember making a commitment to memorizing it. But here's what I would do if I was going to memorize it.
For sure.
If there is a sense to be had, to me, in this particular case, because it's a list, I can definitely see that, and I think it's part of how I memorize that King Henry V thing. Like, not exactly in the way you described it, but there is a logic to why that invention would ascend as opposed to take the elevator or whatever. Right? Like it sort of the logic of it lends itself to itself in terms of retention. But in the case of lists of words, I would, for myself, literally segment it into space. So if it's murder as number one and foolishness as 13, I'm going to have one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine in the memory palace. And I will use a pillar technique. And then I'll try to have the logic of the alphabet help me, right? So if it's
Hmm.
murder, well, Mulder from X-Men, or sorry, X-Files, he's going to maybe murder somebody, right? Uh, I have a character in one of my books named Murder Man, so I can just use him and maybe Mulder, get them together so it's close. And then what was the second one? I didn't memorize it in real time here.
Yeah, no, no, it's okay. So it was evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murder,
Oh, murder wasn't even the first. Okay.
covetousness, covetousness. But isn't that interesting that murder goes to the top of your list, which is what you would anticipate?
Right. I don't know why I got that impression, but
But
it
that's the
is interesting.
impression that you should get.
Yes.
That's what's weird about that list is that murder should be at the top.
Yes.
And however you feel about the other things, I mean, covetousness, I don't think that's second.
Mm. Well, that's why
you know
logic would be so troubling here. So if it's evil thoughts, then it's the same principle. Now, if you want to know that one is one and two is two and three is three, a candle can be there because candles look like one, right?
yeah.
And now I have like Evil Knievel, and he's like beaming thoughts out of his mind. Two is a swan, so he whatever the second thing is can be a swan. Three, and if it turns out four is murder, well, four looks like a sailboat. So now it can have Mulder on a sailboat, so that I'll remember that it's four in the list.
Pushing someone overboard, that's a good
Yeah,
one.
perfect. And then that's where you get logic coming from a different angle. So rather
So this
than the
this
logic
is
being in the
interesting.
presentation of the list, now this is what you mentioned, the beautiful term that you use, the paradox of adding additional information. But this is where you're adding it, but you're not really adding it. You're you're kind of animating it, I would say, rather than thinking of it as additive, it's more animated, so to speak.
Yeah, and I guess the trick, because I had sort of read intros to memory books before and stuff, and gotten that, like you have a bicycle, and then there's these outrageous images of things on different parts of the bicycle, and this is on this wheel, and that's on that wheel. This is on the,
Mm.
and this sounds like this, and that sounds like that, and and my reaction to that was like, I have to remember all that other stuff just to remember the initial thing. But I
Mm.
think the trick that you point out is that it has to have meaning to you,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So what's so I'll tell you how I did this one, and it was pretty soft in terms of like technique, but I had an important insight, right? And you started off with the word context. There's so many passages in the Bible that you will read commentary on, like what does this mean?
Mm.
And I stopped reading those very early on because I didn't find them useful as an actor. But I also discovered that many of them had clearly been interpreted without the person interpreting it going back and reading the page before and the page after.
Right.
You know, like someone said, "Hey, I don't know what this is unclear. What does it mean?" And then everyone comes in, has a bunch of opinions about it, but then it refers back to something very clearly that happened the page before, which is in a part of the text that's just not as well read as this part. So I unlocked a lot of stuff, a lot of sort of, and there's a lot of stuff in there, which is one of the things that really engrossed me with this text, is that it was much more complicated than I thought it would be. Much harder to figure, a lot of mysteries in there, and things I still like. What does that mean? And I sort of have working understandings of what a passage will mean, or what it signifies. But anyway, in this case, I thought, well, what is the significance of the number? It's 13, which is what?
A Danzig song.
It's Jesus plus the apostles, right?
Ah, indeed, yes.
So now it turns into a very interesting scene. So so I go 13. Well, what is that? And then my first thought was, I wish it was 12. And then I went, wait a minute. There's a 13th in there.
Yeah.
Theologically, this is complicated, but thank God I'm not a theologian. I'm a humble actor.
Right, right.
So I am able to propose that potentially Jesus takes up one of these spots, that'll make theologians angry, like he's perfect, but I'm just trying to tell this story. I have a different job. So I check this theory because I go, people are not going to like this. And nobody knows I'm thinking this anyway, right? They don't have to
Right.
know everything that's going on inside my head. As long as I'm making it alive, they'll fill it however they fill it, right? But it has to be alive. Still, I want to check it. So I go back before, and what the scene before is Jesus is having this conversation, this confrontation with the Pharisees. They're healing thousands of people, and the Pharisees come in and they shut it all down because they accuse his apostles of eating bread with unwashed hands. It's like Miracle City, and they're like, we got to lay a parking ticket on you and shut the whole thing down.
Right.
So he has this whole argument with them about what really defiles a man. And where he ends up is, it's not what goes into a man, but it's what comes out of a man that defiles him. And that's what leads into this. For from within, out of the hearts of men proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts. So right after he leaves the Pharisees, he calls all the people together unto him, and he explains to them, and says, it's nothing to do with what goes into you. It's the things that come out of you. And then it says very clearly in the text, and when he was alone with the 12 from the people. So you have this scene where it's the Pharisees, it's all the people and the disciples. And then it changes to they go back into the room and it's just him and the disciples, which is 13 people. So I've confirmed my 13 theory,
Right.
right? Now I go, okay, well, one of these has to be Jesus. So which one is that?
I get you. I think I'm following now. Yeah.
Which one is Jesus? I'll give you the whole list.
Well, he gets murdered,
Evil,
so that's what I'd go for.
evil, close. Evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness.
What did you go for?
Which I went for foolishness because it's the one where I feel like, is foolishness a sin?
Mm. Yeah,
And
well,
then,
it might be in some contexts.
well, and then the question is, well, but do I think the other way to look at it is, do I credit Jesus as having been guilty of any of those other ones? And its strong answer on all of those is no. There's
Mm.
nothing to, if there were something else in the text to indicate that, well, in this scene he seems a little, covetous, but there's none of that. in any of the Gospels, right? The foolishness is interesting, though, because if you deal with the reality of what Jesus is trying to do, is he's trying to communicate a set of principles to his apostles that they keep not getting. I mean, that is all over the gospel according to Mark, you
Mm.
know.
Mm.
Having eyes, see ye not, having ears, hear ye not, are your hearts yet hardened?
Mm.
Do you not yet perceive? And he says that right before this. They go away from the people and they ask him, his disciples ask him again about the parable, and he saith unto them, are ye so without understanding also? Perceive ye not?
Mm.
Right? So
Yeah.
now, instead of this random list, you suddenly have this situation where Jesus makes a point to the Pharisees. And not only does it not land for the Pharisees, but he gets alone with his apostles who have been with him for well over a year now, and they don't get it. And so Jesus says, okay, you want this to be real? You want to understand what I'm talking about? Let's get real. You have evil thoughts. You're an adulterer. You're
Mm.
a fornicator. You, Judas, are going to murder me.
Mm.
All the way around, probably to Peter, whose pride, I think, because Peter is always the one who's proclaiming Jesus, and Jesus is telling him, stop telling people about me because they're going to kill me. And I need all the all the short time I have to get as much of the message out as I can. So
Mm.
stop trumpeting, stop singing my praises. Don't tell people about me just yet.
Mm.
The time will come. Now's not the time. So that's probably Peter. And then foolishness takes on this extraordinary meaning in that I'm Jesus. Somehow I have failed to communicate to these guys my message. So I must be doing something wrong, right?
Mm.
And then that ends up helping the next line because the next line is, and from thence he arose and went into the coasts of Tyre and Sidon and entered into an house and would have no man know it, which could seem like an episodic non sequitur. Okay, this is what happened next. He goes into a far country. This is another thing you have to do. There's all these names, right?
Mm.
What is it? Tyre and Sidon? Is it Idumea? Is it Judea? Is it by the farther side of Jordan? You have to decide which one of these is closest and which one of these is farthest, right?
Mm.
So I decided that Tyre and Sidon is farthest. Certainly culturally, it's farthest, right? Not a lot of Jews over there, right? He's going in among the Greeks, which was the Greeks was the Hebrew idiom for foreigners,
Mm.
right? So there's a line in the next scene actually where it says the woman was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by nation. And it's like, well, which was she, a Greek or a
Mm.
Syro-Phoenician? But in fact, Greek is the general category and Syro-Phoenician is the specific, right?
Mm.
So now this list connects to the story, right?
Mm.
Because he can't understand why he can't teach his own people. He can't teach the religious leaders. He can't teach the people in the general population. He can't even teach his own apostles. He must be foolish somehow,
Mm.
right? So he goes into a foreign country where no one will bother him and he prays. He goes to ask dad, right?
Mm.
And dad answers the prayer in a very unexpected way, which is by sending him the Syro-Phoenician woman. And this is a shock because she asks him to cast a devil out of her daughter. And you know what he says to her? And this blew my mind when I first read it. But Jesus said unto her, let the children first be filled, for it is not meet that I should take the children's bread and cast it unto the dogs.
Mm.
Doesn't feel super Jesus-y, right? This lady comes and says, my daughter has an unclean spirit. Could you cast him out? And he goes, you're a foreigner, you're a Syrophoenician, you're like even amongst the foreigners, you're a half breed. These things all you have to invest them with the cultural context. Like this was shocking.
Mm.
You're Mark and you're going around, you're telling this story. You're like, she was like he went away to pray and be alone. He was like he wanted to be left alone, pray. And this, but people heard about him no matter what. And this Greek came, she wasn't even a Greek, she was a Syrophoenician, and she, went in and disturbed Jesus's prayer and asked him to cast the devil out of her daughter, and he called her a dog and said no. But then she stood up to him, and she answered him and said, "Yes, Lord, but the dogs under the table eat of the children's crumbs." And Jesus said unto her, "For this saying, go thy way. The devil is gone out of thy daughter." And so he's not getting anywhere with his own people. He prays to his father. He goes into he says, "I'm going to get rid of all these local distractions, go into a far place and pray to my father and ask for a key, like, what am I doing wrong?" And the answer he gives him is, "It's time for you to bring the gospel to the nations."
Mm.
Anyway, I mean, that's getting a little bit into the religious aspect of it, but for
No,
the
but
story,
I think there's and please don't get me wrong when I put it this way, but it's the only way I can think to put it. This is the tragedy of memory in our world, right? Because you and I have some amount of time in abundance to do textual analysis, right? And part of the way that memory training has gone in the 20th and the 21st century is to the competitors, the people who memorize fast, in order to get decks of cards down. Uh, I'm not trained in it, but at competitive competitions, there is a category of auditorily spoken names, auditorily spoken words, auditorily spoken numbers, and so forth. That is its own discipline, and you can
yeah.
train for it. But the idea of, I think you've just like given the best mnemonic for working out, this list of 13 in the context of the story. It follows all the rules, of what's called active recall. You've deeply personalized it. It's got variety, which is another rule of this. And, you just understand it. And so that's why I kind of describe it, even though that's not my favorite word, as the tragedy of it. Because as an educator myself, you know,
Mm.
when I was a film studies professor, I would go on and on and on about how that Star Wars 3 is actually Othello in everything but name and sabers or lightsabers. Because if you think about it, and I'm not going to go on a long tangent here, but if you think about it, the psychomachia is exactly the same, right? So like Othello really is a pawn who's manipulated by Iago in order to put
Yeah.
out the light of Desdemona, right? This is
Yeah.
to the nth degree exactly what happens in Star Wars 3, right? It's astonishing. It's shocking how that it
So is
is
Luke
structurally the
is
psych.
Luke
Go ahead.
is Luke is Luke
He's
Othello?
Othello.
Who
He's
Luke
Othello,
is?
right? And there is no Iago as such in an individual, right? But there
But it's
is the temptation to put out the light. It's almost as if Darth Vader is the Iago in a way, but one way or the other, no matter which way you slice it, the structure, the psychomachia structure, it
hmm.
is the same story, right? And it is the brilliance that Shakespeare drew out of another story himself, right? So understanding those structures, it makes Othello more mnemonic to me just by knowing that it's a psychomachia, right? Assuming I'm
Right.
even saying that correctly. And I think that, when you mentioned you wouldn't be a scholar because you can't read that fast. Well, I don't know scholars that read that fast. Often what is part of their memory is that they're seeing these structures. They're thinking at that level that you did, right? To
Going
demonstrate
slower.
this list of 30. Yeah, and Nietzsche had already always said the real talent in reading is to be a slow reader.
Oh,
It's one of his best quotes, is that the future is reading slower. Um, anyway,
that's it.
I can totally see being able to get down to verbatim just from analysis, feeling, working out the logic. understanding the deep structure, because I've been there in different senses as a film studies professor. I mean, I could go on and on and on about Star Wars at the time because I was just so
Yeah.
deep into, and I was also teaching adaptation, and I was deep into Shakespeare at that time and so forth.
Wait,
And
adaptation of movie?
yeah, I was a Mercator scholar in Germany, and that was my gig, was
I
to teach.
adaptation is ah, it's on my top 10 for sure.
Yeah.
I love that movie.
Oh, I'm sorry. I taught the topic adaptation,
I
but
thought you meant the
we
movie.
did talk about the movie adaptation as well. Yes. Um,
So the end of that story, so that was what gave me the meaning to the interaction.
mm,
And then the other thing was just a simple, I guess, memory palace, which is since I had already made the choice of putting 12 chairs in the middle, then I had the sequence that I went in around the circle. And that word was on, and that sin was on each chair as I went around.
right, right.
That was it. What I needed to find was where to land, you
Yes.
know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I never actually chose where uh where 10 of the 13 sins were, right?
Yeah.
Because I chose foolish, I chose pride because I assigned that to Peter, and I chose murder because I assigned that to Judas.
Mm.
And it gave me something to play that people would recognize, you know. But other than that, it was just placing them in the chairs.
Well,
One, two.
I think you've raised something that I've experienced many times that may be useful for people who want to do this kind of thing. Needing someplace to land is something that happens a lot for me with long form verbatim. And one thing that I learned to do, so I memorize these things that are like idam shriram countea kshetram iti pidjite etadio veditam prahukshetrashna edita. And I would get to something where, even though there's help in the lines because they have their own metricality and so forth, and they're jeweled, I would say, like they have a kind of like a bracelet structure. Sometimes there'll be a
Hmm.
line that comes that is so challenging that I need to work out a destination. And often what the destination is just to place in the memory palace the space for the verse and then move on and then come back to it later because I have a destination. And then this may or may not be part of why I call it the magnetic memory method, but because I've been willing to move on and not force myself to make something work that just isn't quite working right now, then once I've established the next line, it makes it so much easier to follow the chairs where the 12 apostles are. And now that next line that's been established is the 13th apostle, so to speak. It is the destination. So
Yeah,
that's been a key
interesting.
strategy for me with these long form memorizations. It would be the same in English as it is in in Sanskrit or in Latin or whatever I'm memorizing. When I'm memorizing other languages, I often have to let things go and find the destination, as you phrased it very, very wonderfully.
Now I'm interested with the Sanskrit.
Mm.
Um, because like I said, part of it is feeling it in my mouth and the physical sensation of that rhythm that I trust. And as a musician, you have independence, which is,
Mm.
I think, something that a lot of people don't develop. And I think there's probably a crossover between being able to have independence physically and being able to memorize parallel tracks of things as well, but also just to let something go, like my strumming hand is taking care of itself, and I'm thinking about the frets, right, that kind of thing.
I think
But
that's
I'm
right.
I'm
There is a perform like there may be something that lends itself to having being a performer or having proclivities towards performance and also being able to let things go. Like I've
Yeah.
certainly made mistakes reciting things. When I was in a band and I made a mistake, I remember I'll never forget it. The drummer Alberto Atala, one of the greatest drummers I've ever worked with, he said, Anthony, you look like you made a little bit of a mistake there last night or earlier this night or whatever. And I was like, oh, damn, really? What song was it or whatever? And he said, It doesn't matter. The thing is if it looks like a mistake, it's a mistake. So don't look like you made a mistake when you
Right.
hit a wrong note, because it's inevitable that it's going to happen, right? So I think that's part of the
But
freedom that we have to just recite whatever we've memorized.
absolutely, absolutely, and yeah, and to capture the spirit of it, there's that whole question of like, where do the words come from? What
Mm,
are the words? I mean, ultimately, they're representations of something that they themselves don't quite grasp, you know.
yeah.
Um, but what do you have that feeling of like the rhythm of the words and the way it physically feels saying the words in your mouth with the Sanskrit? Does that help you? Or do you think it's more about it's just in your long-term memory, and so if you get out of the way, it just comes out?
I think there's different ways to look at it, and it can be all those things. One of the considerations is that in Sanskrit specifically, there are people who believe that enlightenment is achieved at certain levels relative to proper pronunciation of mantras, right? Even the word mantra, like you just don't get it, man, because it's not mantra, it's not mantra, it's mantra, like this kind of thing, right?
Right.
And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I find that perplexing and troubling because of the ineffable character of it that you just mentioned. Like these dudes don't even know what they're doing, right? But they may be right because there may be epigenetic characteristics to things. So, for example, and this is very interesting, I talked about the swan and the candle and the sailboat, right? But there
Right.
for four and two and one. But there are other memory techniques for numbers that maybe have an epigenetic thing. So, and this has been going on for hundreds of years and by extension, thousands of years, there's a thing called the major system, and zero is associated with S, C, soft C, S, soft C, and Z. One is T and D, two is N, three is M, four is R, five is L, six is Ch, Sh, J, seven is K or hard G, and eight is F or V, and nine is B or P. That's a big mouthful. But what I would draw our attention to is zero, S, soft Z, Z, S, soft Z, Z, right? One, T, D, T and D, two, N, three, M, we're like moving around the mouth. When we get to six, ch, sh, j, they're all cha, 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 like in the same part of the mouth. Now, if you look back
Yeah,
at the Katapayadi, which is where this comes from in the earliest instance that I've found in the ancient Indian tradition, you have the similar patterns that the numbers are associated to consonants, but not just associated to consonants, but they're linked to the consonants that are coming from a particular part of the mouth. So
yeah,
even though I think the ineffable can be reached without pronunciation, I have empathy and sympathy for the idea that no, if you get your mantras pronounced just right, you may well like be more enlightened than the other dude. I don't know, but that's to me avoiding the larger issues of what enlightenment is, because that's a game of comparison and so on. But I don't ultimately know the answer. It seems like
yeah.
a
I think my issue with it is that I think it'll be a fairly cheap enlightenment if there's only one way there, I mean, I expect enlightenment to have more than one dimension.
well, this is
But
always the question of oneness, right? Is oneness, is the multiplicity in the one, or is there ultimately no one? I don't know.
yeah, me neither. I haven't figured it out, but it's no, I think it it's interesting how so we're getting into very deep traditions now. And I have a guy that I do Bible study with, and he's like, there's specific verses about the power of saying the word, you
Mm,
know, and I think that's true across many religions, and certainly the association with numbers and letters and you know like just the tetragrammaton, right? Which
mm,
was, it was a prohibition against, because the power of the Lord's name was so great that you could only write it with the consonants. In other words, you didn't write it with the vowels in, so you wouldn't say it, and so
mm,
that you were the prohibition against saying an oath in the Lord's name was that strong because of the belief in the power of invocation. And the creation myth of Judaism and Christianity is invocation,
Mm.
right? The world was spoken into existence. So,
In principio erat verbum. In
yeah,
the beginning was the word, although I don't know why it wasn't the letter. That puzzles me a little bit.
it's interesting. The word versus the letter. Yeah, did he start out so maybe the alphabet came after, maybe the alphabet came afterwards, and the word that's talking about what I was talking about earlier, which is the word under the language word. It was
Mm,
big W word
yeah.
versus what we speak is small w words, which have to be made up of letters and stuff. But
It might
I,
interest you and our listeners. There's a book, the current English translation that people can find is called 30 Statues by Giordano Bruno. Bruno was deep into these questions. And in the beginning there, he says, abit ergo chaos non statuam non figuram. And it's not even imaginable. So there's no statue for what being is to refer to. And he's thinking of a very specific memory technique, but there's no figure for it either. And yet he says, we can still talk about it. Galileo reportedly said, I've never read it myself, but I've heard Noam Chomsky cite it like a zillion times, that Galileo apparently was just intrigued to fascination and self-hypnosis with the fact that this finite alphabet produces at least the appearance of infinite expression, right? But this goes back to what
possibilities.
Bruno was saying. Is there really an infinity? Because if we don't have a statue for it, if we don't have a figure for it, right?
Yeah,
How
you can't
it's almost where
represent it.
Wittgenstein got to, of that we cannot speak, we should remain silent.
Yeah,
Which
and I
should is
and
such a dangerous word
so
because
it's
obviously we're not
funny.
going to do it.
My dad actually studied at Cambridge and studied under Wittgenstein at Cambridge.
Oh wow.
Uh, and he had, I think they were called the Brown Book and the Blue Book. He never really was able to compile all his stuff into anything resembling a linear narrative or expression of his.
Mm,
He didn't unify it into a grand theory. It was all these sort of observations of how what we say doesn't really mean what we think it, or it could mean many different things, that kind of. So it's sort of these, it's just a collection. His students compiled their notes into these observations. And so I think it's called the Blue Book and the Brown Book. Anyway, my dad had
I believe
these, and
that's
I thought,
correct, actually. Um,
my dad had these, right? And after he passed, out of sort of that guilt of like, I should know, but I had this strange intellectual guilt that I had my dad had studied with the guy, for goodness sake. And and I couldn't make heads or tails of it.
I think I think Bloom calls this the anxiety of influence, right?
I, I read a few pages and I was like, this is impossible. I don't know what's happening. And I just gave up. But
Myself, I
anyway,
think it's a little bit zen. It's kind of like you get points just by trying, and then if you feel like it's torn apart the idea that language actually can do stuff, then it probably has worked its magic, you know? Um,
yeah, so something you said, I haven't read that much Nietzsche about, made me the Giordano Bruno quote made me think about something that I've read in Nietzsche. I haven't read that much, but I was required in acting school to read The Birth of Tragedy, which I think is an
recommendable.
extraordinary
Mm.
extraordinary essay, that reflects
Especially when
on.
we're going to talk about chiasmus.
Oh, really? Why is
Mm.
that?
Well, I think it's in The Birth of Tragedy I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
Is
cut
it?
you off, but I think it's in Birth of
No.
Tragedy where Nietzsche is all about this chiasmatic being, like it's almost like an ontology, right? Where one force calls the other into existence. And his warning to German culture is that if you don't resolve the Apollonian and the Dionysian, this
Sure.
chiasmatic divide where you're not resolving it because you're not ever essentially going to agnoresis. I can't even say it right now. Peripatia and agnoriasis. I got to say them together, and then I can pronounce
Yeah,
it. But it's
the
just.
extra information.
But I might be thinking of something else. But I think that's in Birth of Tragedy, and he's really concerned that we are able to bridge that.
Recon-
Yeah,
yeah,
or bridge it, or it depends on the translation.
in
Reconcile.
the way that yeah, in the way that that classic Greek drama did,
Yeah.
with the with the main players and the chorus representing the two, the Apollinian and the Dionysian. Um, but but one of the interesting things that he talks about is that the moment of ideation, where suddenly, when man was able to turn the world into concepts, it broke the spell of chaos. So that, and he has this image of there's a piece of bark on this sea, and it's so, you know, involved in the motion of the sea that it's just part of the chaos. But suddenly, when the man can see forces and angles and pressure and stuff like that, he can erect a sail and he can use the wind. And
Mhm.
his ability to represent different parts of the universe then makes the universe manageable. And it's so interesting to bring that back to Bruno, who's saying, okay, but here's this thing we can't represent at all. So
Well,
how do we manage?
Nietzsche eventually did read Bruno. I have on good word because in Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche talks about Bruno, and he talks about Bruno in the context of Spinoza. And by the time that you get to also Sprach Zarathustra and Ecce Homo, I don't think Nietzsche thinks there's free will anymore. In fact, Human All Too Human is a great meditation on how there is no free will. So a lot of Birth of Tragedy is kind of abandoned. Like Nietzsche's strangely consistent, but this idea of man being able to erect things in order to have some sort of control, gay science, uh, I think maybe aphorism 103 is the one where he's just like, let us beware of thinking the universe is alive, and it is the idea of order, or even us having any way to participate in order, is just the idea, is the exception of exceptions, that this would happen at all. Anyway, the thing is um Nietzsche gets very zen. I think this is sort of my reading. And Deleuze says that one of the major mistakes that people make with Nietzsche is that, he went mad and then there's no value in it anymore, right? But Deleuze says, no, 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 no. It's precisely the opposite, because the more artistic it gets, and the more, I would say, this is not Deleuze's words, but the more zen it gets, then the more resistant it is to the systems of oppression that he had been talking about all along, but sort of highlighting that we don't really have free will in how we respond to it anyway. But the more artistic you are about it, the more, and this may reflect on your own work as an artist, right? The more it is an act of resistance that is purely not containable. It is,
Mm.
it is the figure, the statue that Bruno doesn't think that you can establish on an ontological level, and what memory is, etc.
Yeah,
But it
and
stands, and so you have
it,
people
it
like yourself who actually stand it again from within your head, which I think is so admirable and fascinating.
and it resists the building of sails to direct you in
Well, in a
the
sense,
in the
yes, right? Like I've watched
water.
your reel, and the way people are responding to you, right?
Mm.
I think there are no words to kind of say things. And that's kind of what Bruno is saying. It's kind of what Nietzsche is saying. If we try to locate it in words, we're never actually able to get to it. And this is what I think Wittgenstein got to as well. It becomes quite mystical, but you're erecting the sail in community. So it's not really about you. It's not about them. It's this
Yeah,
becoming, or a pure becoming, as the ontologist would say. Like it's reality building itself out of itself without a self, that it's just all kind of happening.
Well, and so yeah, that's so interesting. And by the way, let me just say, I love that we're getting very esoteric with this. It's way above my head. You've read a lot more of this stuff than I have. Nonetheless, I don't require a representation of those theories to be tantalized by them and enjoy them. So I love sort of the mind walk we're going on here. Um,
Enlightenment achieved.
but you are getting back to um, what the show is about, what theater is about. Um, is that it's participatory, you know and what's so interesting about what you're talking about this consensus building of reality, um, is that so many people get locked for whatever reason, and you can look at, I don't know, like Europe in the Middle Ages, sort of get locked in this relationship to authority where what the world is given to you,
Right.
versus you are a co-creator of it. And I think that's why there was such a profound explosion of creativity, but also a profound undermining of authority when the Bible got translated into all the native languages.
Mm.
Because suddenly, the knowledge authority was undermined, and all of the temporal authority rested firmly on that knowledge authority. And people were like, well, we can come up with our own set of agreements. We don't
Yeah.
need to be serfs anymore, and we don't need to pay indulgences anymore, and we don't need to not point our lenses towards the sky anymore.
Mhm.
you know, um, and so I think there's a renewing aspect that theater shares with worship, uh, which is of coming together as a community and agreeing of what you agree upon, and in all interactions that don't become dead and rote, there's spontaneity in it, you know, and so I think, and this is me shamelessly promoting the show, but also talking about what I love.
Please do.
Um, and anyone who loves the immediacy of theater will love to come see the Gospel according to Mark. And anyone who wants to experience what I believe the transmission of this gospel was very much like in the early days, because there's some tradition um, about how this gospel was being told, and then when Peter was in prison, Mark was encouraged to write it down, with the understanding being that part of, like, when he went down to Alexandria to found the Coptic church, what became the Coptic church in Alexandria, that in his missions he had basically been Peter's scribe, and he was telling, but he split up from Peter and they were doing separate missions, but he was telling Peter's story in more or less the form that he ended up writing it down. And there's other theories I have about why he structured it the way he did, but I won't get into that. Um, but I forget, I can't quote where it is, but there's the scripture that says, wheresoever there are two or more of you together, I am there too.
Mm.
Um, it's a very fundamental, original way of worship, and it's a play. So if you like great language, and if you like a great story that's all plot and it's just one extraordinary event to another, and a beautiful tragedy, uh, and if you want to feel like you're you're experiencing the scripture the way it was experienced for most people throughout history, which was to be received orally and all of a piece, you know, not 7 lines of verse and then 45 minutes of the pastor telling you what he thinks about it, but being in the story and following the story of Jesus. You'll love this show. I love it. It's changed my life, and I think everyone could benefit from seeing it, and I want to take it to the world. So, if there's
Uh,
anyone out there who wants to book it, go to kingjameslive.org. Send me an email at booking@kingjameslive.org. That's the only destination you need to get me to come do this thing for you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ashley. It was amazing. And we talked about Nietzsche. It's 109, by the way, not 103. I'm pretty sure it's aphorism 109 I was referring to. But I want to bring it back to Nietzsche to get your thoughts on this, because
Please.
I want to encourage people to go and see your show. And I think Nietzsche would be a big supporter of you, because people don't get it. He said God is dead, right? But he didn't think that was a good thing. He thought it was a very bad
Yeah.
thing, actually. It was a warning against basically a lot of the decadence we see now. And I had a professor named Frederick Olfers, who was the Nietzsche chair at the European Graduate School. And he said what Nietzsche is really saying, and these were pretty close to his exact words. He said, what Nietzsche is really saying is that if that's the way you're going to worship your God, he may as well be dead, And I think
Yeah.
that that's what is beautiful about what you're doing, is bringing it to life so that it isn't the pastor, not that there's no need for pastors, don't get me wrong, but it
Of
is a
course.
direct access to the recitation and the dramatization and the spirit, spirit, inspire, breath, all that stuff. We can play etymologies. Uh, I wanted to speak with you the instant that I saw it, and help, do whatever I can from my little corner of the world to bring attention to it. And I admire it very much. And if I can be of service in any way, let me know. But at the end of the day, I would encourage people, if they're in Australia and if I can figure out how to do bookings and I could swing it, I would book you. It's not in my
I'll come
talent
up.
check, but
I,
I'd love to see it.
I'd love to. I'd love to do it. I'll do it anywhere, and it's my mission to take it to the world, and I feel blessed to have your support. I really appreciate it. And just the last word, I think the encapsulation of what we both just said is something that people in the church call the sufficiency of the word, and that's how I feel about it. The word is enough as long as it's shared in in fellowship, and that's what the show's about. So again, thanks for the platform and thanks for the extraordinary discussion. I really enjoyed it.
I want to thank Ashley again for this wonderful discussion. I am so inspired and have learned a lot from it, especially in rethinking certain things based on what he said. So I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes just sharing what my takeaways are from this. And one of the first is the importance of textual analysis. Now, I called it in the interview the kind of a tragedy of having enough time to do it, but at the same time, you don't necessarily have to have that much time in order to spend some time on textual analysis. And I know that it can be a stretch. Like, well, how's this going to help with math formulas and whatnot? And I would just suggest thinking about textual analysis like this. So Ashley mentioned, commentaries not being all that useful. And this reminded me of something, and I was having a conversation just this morning with my friend Rob where it came up again, is this idea that I studied a lot in university called the metaphysics of presence. And part of the idea of the metaphysics of presence is that we're always so focused on what is present, what is there, such as commentaries. And Ashley had mentioned, not necessarily using them. And this would be privileging what is absent so that you do the thinking. Right? You make present what is absent through a depth of engagement, and this helps with more memory. And I found that useful over the years. I just never thought about it in quite the way that came out through this discussion. So that was very, very useful. The other thing was that you can have spatial elements without necessarily using a memory palace formally help you remember things in a way that is ultimately the memory palace technique looked at by other means. So Ashley talked about the 13 sins and using space in a particular way, that the final station, so to speak, in the memory palace helps guide you through the journey. And it's almost like station 13 points back to 1, 2, 3, 4, and up to 12. And I shared how I think that that relates to ways that I have used Sanskrit, but it sort of reasserts that importance. In other videos and trainings and whatnot, I've talked about it as kind of tamping down in a way. But the way Ashley talks about it is different yet. It's another variation. So I would think about that. Also the idea of blocking, being able to use different areas for different ideas. You don't necessarily have to be an actor or a speaker to think about how you're going to use areas of a memory palace to have certain effects that trigger what you're trying to remember. Certainly in recall rehearsal, I can see that being very, very useful. And I think the other point, and this might be something to consider over and over and over again, is the use of the ego. Maybe starting with the acknowledgement of the ego as having force, having a plus and a minus. And if we can get psychologically sound about the fact that we have egos, it can be an incredible driver of success. And fear came up. And fear, of course, is a thing that threatens the ego. So how exactly that's a specific mnemonic, well, maybe it isn't, but it is a way of, if you are on the fence, not getting started, worried that you never have enough time, or you would never have enough memory palaces, or you would never have enough images and so forth, think about the role of the ego in this, and think about how maybe you could come up with some fears that would drive you to take action. Because one of the things that I've noticed that a lot of people who have been more successful than others with using memory techniques is that they have a real fire under their backsides. They have to succeed. And memory techniques, they're not the only way to get things into memory, or maybe they are, because rote learning is a technique. It is a mnemonic in the sense that mnemonic means memory technique. So depending on the nature of the pain that you're trying to remove from your life, you may be compelled to explore what the real work is in memory techniques a little bit more deeply, because of trying to think about, how you could get your ego a little more fearful, maybe when it's useful, or remove the fear and have other parts of your ego somehow give you a driving force. And then, of course, using what you already know is related to your ego, and that is another memory hook. The key point that I would draw us to is the term the real work. And I know that term well from having done a lot of card magic. Magicians use that term, the real work. And one of the really interesting ideas there, Adam Gopnik, I think his name is, wrote a book called The Real Work, is that we, as magicians, we can't experience the illusion that we're creating for others. And I think that's another sort of point that comes out to me that wasn't said in this interview, and it may be a philosophical idea, but one that might help you, is that, and it's related to ego here, is that often we don't put in the work because we are not getting praise for it. Nobody's seeing us. Nobody's clapping for us, giving us that applause. But if we want that applause in the future, or all of the rewards and benefits that come from having accomplished something in the future, the real work is basically creating things for others that you yourself can't necessarily enjoy. Sacrifice, perhaps. And I think that is one more reason to be subscribed if you aren't already to this program. Hit that thumbs up if you have one on your screen to let the robots know, because we're going to need to make more and more sacrifices for each other in order to share what optimized memory can do for you, so that your ego can avoid fear and can skip over a lot of unnecessary pains and be prodded around a little bit in order to get yourself to do the real work, because the real work is really where all the fruits and enjoyments of labor are not lost, if you follow the Shakespearean reference I'm trying to make here. So thank you again. Thanks again to Ashley. And until we have a chance to speak again, come visit me at magneticmemorymethod.com and keep yourself magnetic.